Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Don't forget to like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And click the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future episodes. Today we're going to travel back in time to explore the rise of the Indian working class.
A critical chapter of modern Indian history.
It really is. And it's fascinating how intertwined this journey is with India's struggle for independence.
Absolutely.
It's really essential knowledge for anyone who's interested in modern Indian history. And especially, for those of you out there prepping for the UPSC exams.
Especially that GS1 Modern Indian History section.
Exactly.
We've got a really interesting mix of sources for this deep dive. Historical analysis, first-hand accounts. We're going to try to bring this era to life.
I love it. Okay. So before we get into all the specifics,
Sure.
how did this Indian working class even come to be?
Well, what's really fascinating is that the very concept of an Indian working class is tied to colonialism itself.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Before British rule, India obviously had skilled artisans and craftsmen, but the idea of like a unified working class, as we understand it today, that didn't really exist.
So are you saying that the British, in a way, unintentionally created the very force that would challenge their rule?
It's a bit of a historical paradox, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, by dismantling India's traditional village system and pushing for industrialization to, serve their own interests.
Of course.
They inadvertently created this whole new social dynamic, a concentrated workforce with shared grievances.
Right. Okay, so we've got this emerging working class. But what led to their discontent?
Well, think about the ripple effects of the Industrial Revolution reaching India.
Okay.
The British needed raw materials.
Of course.
New markets for their manufactured goods.
Right.
This led to, well, think about it, the rise of textile mills.
Okay.
In cities like Calcutta and Bombay.
Those are big ones.
Huge. Tea plantations springing up in Assam. And, of course, the expansion of railways and coal mining.
Yeah, all requiring a lot of labor.
Exactly. And all of this needed workers.
And those workers, they weren't exactly treated well, were they?
Unfortunately, no. The sources paint a very grim picture of life for the average worker.
Yeah.
Long hours, extremely low wages, unsafe working conditions, and, very sadly, rampant child labor.
Ugh, it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
But, weren't there any attempts at all to improve these conditions?
There were. Starting in 1881, the British introduced these Factory Acts to regulate working hours and address child labor.
So some progress was made.
On paper, yes. But enforcement was weak, and the reality on the ground remained pretty grim.
So the gap between the legislation and the actual implementation left many workers feeling disillusioned.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it fueled the need for something more powerful, a collective voice.
And that's where we start to see the seeds of the working class movement being sown.
Exactly. And, those early efforts were very localized, focusing on specific industries or regions.
Right.
But they were crucial. They laid the groundwork for a larger, more unified movement.
I see. Can you give us a sense of these early stirrings? Who were some of the key players?
Well, think about individuals like Sasipada Banerjee. He founded the newspaper Fara Shramjeevi, dedicated to workers' rights.
So important to have that platform.
So important. Or Narayana Mekhaji Lokhande, who championed workers' causes through his newspaper Deen Bandhu.
Another one.
And even formed the Bombay Mill and Mill Hands Association.
Wow. So these pioneers, they really recognized the power of collective action.
Absolutely.
And having a shared platform.
A shared voice.
Yeah.
So important.
It's amazing how those early advocates, they really laid the foundation for what was to come. It wasn't just through newspapers, though, right? There were strikes during this period, too, right?
Absolutely. One notable example is the strike by workers of the Great Indian Peninsular Railways in 1899. And, even though these early strikes were often localized, they still captured public attention.
I bet.
Think about the impact of newspapers like Tilax Kesari and Maratha.
Right.
They amplified these events and garnered support for the workers' cause.
So we see this growing awareness of the workers' plight.
Definitely.
And their fight for just basic rights.
Absolutely.
Was there any particular event or movement that marked a significant turning point in their struggle?
The Swadeshi movement of the early 1900s played a huge role.
Okay.
It wasn't just about boycotting British goods.
Right.
It was about fostering this sense of national identity and self-reliance.
Right.
And that resonated deeply with the workers, many of whom saw their exploitation as intrinsically linked to British rule.
So the struggle for worker rights became intertwined with the larger fight for independence.
Precisely.
Wow.
Leaders like Ashwini Kumar Banerjee and Pravat Kumar Rao Chaudhuri,
Okay.
they were inspired by this Swadeshi spirit.
Mm.
They started connecting the dots between labor rights and self-rule.
It's a crucial shift, isn't it? It's no longer just about better working conditions. It's about reclaiming dignity and autonomy,
Exactly.
both for the worker and for the nation.
Exactly. And this paves the way for the next phase of the movement, the rise of trade unions.
Now that's a game changer. What were the driving forces behind the emergence of these unions?
Well, World War I had a significant impact.
Of course. Yeah.
The economic fallout led to these skyrocketing prices.
Oh, yeah.
Stagnant wages, making life even harder for the working class.
Yeah.
But it also coincided with the formation of the International Labor Organization.
The ILO.
Yes, in 1919.
So the workers' struggle starts gaining some international recognition.
Precisely. The ILO's focus on labor rights provided a global platform
I see.
and gave momentum to the movement in India.
Right.
This, coupled with, those economic hardships, pushed Indian workers towards this organized action.
And that's where the All India Trade Union Congress comes into the picture.
Right.
The AITUC.
Exactly. Founded in 1920, the AITUC marked a watershed moment.
Wow.
For the first time, workers across different industries and regions
Right.
had a unified platform to voice their demands.
That must have been incredibly empowering.
It must have been.
Yeah. It must have felt like a giant leap forward. But the AITUC wasn't the only player in the game, right?
Yeah.
What about the Ahmedabad Textile Labor Association?
Ah, yes. The Ahmedabad Textile Labor Association, also known as Major Mahajan Sabha,
Right.
emerged around the same time thanks to Mahatma Gandhi's efforts.
Okay.
And under the leadership of Ansuyabin Sarabhai, it played a critical role, particularly in the textile industry.
So we see these different approaches emerging. The national platform of the AITUC.
Yes.
And then the more localized, industry-specific focus of the Ahmedabad Textile Labor Association. What other key organizations were shaping the landscape during this period?
Well, there were several others. For example, in 1922, the Central Labor Board was established in Bombay.
Okay.
While the Bengal Trade Union Federation brought together workers in that region, the All India Railway Men's Federation, or AIRF, was crucial for those working in the railways.
It's like this tapestry of interconnected efforts,
It is.
each contributing to the growing strength of the movement.
Yeah.
Were there any particular events that you think really captured the spirit of this era?
The first ever May Day celebration in India in 1923 was truly symbolic.
Oh, wow.
Organized by the Labour Kisan Party of Hindustan in Madras, it demonstrated the power of solidarity, uniting workers across the nation.
May Day. Such a powerful symbol of labor rights, even today. But let's not forget about the larger political context, right?
Yeah.
How did these burgeoning labor movements intersect with the ongoing struggle for independence?
Well, movements like the Khilafat movement, the anti-Rawlat agitations, and the non-cooperation movement had a profound impact on the working class.
Okay.
They fostered this sense of national unity and purpose, further fueling their fight for their own rights.
So it's not just these parallel tracks. These movements are feeding into each other,
Exactly.
reinforcing each other.
Absolutely.
What about the Congress? I mean, they were the leading force in the independence movement. How did they view this growing labor movement?
Well, the Congress had a complex relationship with labor.
I bet.
On the one hand, their resolutions often expressed support for labor unions
Okay.
and condemned the exploitation of workers by foreign companies.
Yeah.
They recognized the power of the working class and its potential role in achieving independence.
But there's a but coming, isn't there?
There is a but, you're right. The Congress also hesitated to directly challenge Indian industrialists,
Right.
a powerful group within their own ranks.
Of course. Of course.
And this created tension and ambiguity
Yeah.
within the labor movement itself.
That must have been a delicate balancing act for the Congress to navigate those different interests.
It was.
And then, of course, there's Gandhi, who always had a unique perspective on social movements.
Always.
How did his philosophy shape the labor movement?
Well, Gandhi's emphasis on peaceful resolution and social reform over strikes
Yeah.
added another layer of complexity.
Of course.
He believed in dialogue and persuasion
Yeah.
to bridge the gap between workers and employers. And while he acknowledged the workers' plight, he also cautioned against actions that might disrupt social harmony or undermine the larger struggle for independence.
So a multitude of ideologies and approaches are emerging within this growing movement. Was this leading to any internal divisions?
Yes, absolutely. The Congress's sometimes inconsistent involvement in economic struggles created space for other ideologies to gain traction. In the late 1920s, communist leaders, inspired by the Russian
Oh,
Revolution,
wow.
began organizing and mobilizing workers, gaining influence within some unions.
So their approach was a little bit more confrontational.
Much more, advocating for direct action and class struggle. And this ideological divide further created tension within the AITUC.
So it sounds like the labor movement is becoming increasingly fragmented.
It is.
Did this fragmentation have any lasting consequences?
Oh, absolutely. And we'll dive into those consequences, along with the impact of key legislation like the Trade Union Act of 1926, when we continue our deep dive in Part 2. Welcome back to our deep dive into the history of the Indian working class.
Last time, we were talking about all those growing complexities within the labor movement.
Yeah.
The influence of figures like Gandhi,
Right.
definitely a lot for, a new UPSC aspirant to keep track of.
Absolutely. And all of this was happening alongside some significant legal developments.
Oh, right.
Most notably, the Trade Union Act of 1926.
That was a landmark piece of legislation, wasn't it? What kind of impact did it actually have on the ground?
Well, it was a big deal.
Yeah.
For the first time, trade unions were officially recognized as legal entities in India.
Wow.
The act laid down guidelines for their registration and operation, granting them legal protection for their activities.
So imagine
Right, imagine the shift this created.
for workers who had been organizing.
Yeah, previously in a much more precarious legal landscape.
Right, right.
So yeah, it was a pretty big deal.
This must have been a huge win for the labor movement.
It was definitely a step forward.
Yeah.
But we have to remember that the British government wasn't about to hand over complete control.
Right.
The act also imposed limitations,
Of course.
especially concerning political activities.
That makes sense. The British were always wary of anything that might threaten their authority.
Absolutely.
How did the labor movement navigate this new legal landscape?
Well, despite those limitations, the Trade Union Act provided a framework for organized labor to operate within the system.
Yeah.
But, the late 1920s and early 1930s were still a time of immense hardship and unrest.
Right.
The economic situation was precarious.
Yeah.
And the influence of communist ideology was growing,
Right.
leading to this surge in strikes and labor activism.
And this is where figures like Muzaffar Ahmed, S.A. Dange, and Philip Spratt come into play.
Exactly. These leaders were really inspired by those communist ideals and pushed for more radical action, challenging both colonial rule and the capitalist system.
A prime example of this growing militancy, the 6-month-long strike.
Yes.
In Bombay textile mills.
In 1928.
Led by S.A. Dange.
And the Gurney Kamgar Union.
Right.
This was a major confrontation.
That shook the city.
It really did.
And highlighted, I think, the workers' growing determination.
Absolutely.
How did the British government react to this wave of strikes?
Well, unfortunately, it was more of a crackdown. In 1929, they introduced the Public Safety Ordinance and the Trade Disputes Act.
Measures designed to
limit the power of unions
and restrict their ability to
organize strikes.
Right.
These were very clear attempts to control the growing labor unrest.
That's always the way, isn't it? Trying to suppress a movement.
It is.
Rather than addressing its root causes.
Unfortunately, it often is.
And then things escalated even further with the Meerut conspiracy case.
Oh, yes. The Meerut conspiracy case of 1929. That was a major turning point.
It really was.
The government arrested 31 prominent labor leaders. Including Muzaffar Ahmed, S.A. Dange,
right.
Jugalkar, Philip Spratt, Ben Bradley, Shaukat Usmani.
All big names.
And others.
Okay.
They were accused of conspiring to overthrow the British Raj.
A very serious charge at the time.
Extremely serious.
So the government just went after the leadership, hoping to meddle the movement from the top down.
Exactly.
The trial dragged on for years.
It did.
Attracting, I bet, international attention.
A lot of attention.
Ultimately, many of the accused were
convicted
and sentenced to lengthy prison terms.
Sadly.
The Meerut conspiracy case. It really had a chilling effect on the entire labor movement, didn't it?
It really did. It weakened its organizational structure and instilled this fear among many workers.
Making it much harder
to mobilize and organize effectively.
It really highlights how easily a government can use, legal means to suppress dissent. Did the labor movement recover from this setback?
Well, the early 1930s were undoubtedly a difficult period.
I bet.
You know, the Murit conspiracy case had cast this long shadow.
Yeah.
And those internal divisions we were talking about earlier.
Right, with Gandhi.
Right. Those differences in ideology continued to play out,
Right.
leading to, further fragmentation.
So it wasn't just the external pressure from the British.
No.
There were also these internal rifts
Yes.
pulling the movement in different directions.
Absolutely.
In 1931, there were two major splits
Yes.
within the AITUC.
That's right.
The first
Led to the formation of the All India Trade Union Federation,
Right.
led by N.M. Joshi.
Right.
This faction favored a more moderate reformist approach, emphasizing collaboration with the government and employers.
Right, okay.
The second split, driven by those ideological differences with the communists,
Yeah.
resulted in the formation of the Red Trade Union Congress.
Wow.
And these divisions, they further weakened the movement's ability to present this united front.
It's fascinating how those internal debates really mirror, those larger ideological struggles
Right.
happening around the world at the time.
Absolutely.
But amidst all this internal turmoil,
Yeah,
the fight for independence was still raging on.
it was.
How did these two struggles, labor rights and independence, how did they continue to intersect?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Because despite those divisions
Right.
and that crackdown,
Yeah.
workers continued to actively participate in the civil disobedience movement
Of 1930.
of 1930.
Wow.
This really shows how deeply intertwined the labor struggle and the fight for self-rule were in the minds of many Indians.
So even with that internal fragmentation,
Yes.
there was still this sense of
Shared purpose.
when it came to challenging British rule.
Absolutely.
However, after the initial fervor of the civil disobedience movement,
Yeah,
the labor movement faced, I imagine, a period of decline.
it did.
Right? It was fragmented,
Fragmented.
facing renewed repression
Sadly, yeah.
and struggling to regain its footing.
It was.
It sounds like the movement was at a crossroads.
It really was.
Did it manage to recover
Well,
and rebuild momentum?
there were some glimmers of hope.
Okay.
The Congress, realizing they really needed the support of the working class to achieve independence,
Yeah.
started making efforts to mend their relationship with labor.
Okay.
They formed a labor committee in 1936 to address those workers' grievances.
I see.
And their manifesto
Yeah.
included support for the formation of unions.
So a shift in strategy from the Congress,
Yeah.
perhaps recognizing the power.
The power of a unified working class.
And as we move into the late 1930s
Yes.
and those tumultuous years
Yes.
leading up to World War II,
Exactly.
we see yet another turning point in this remarkable journey.
We do.
I can't wait to hear about it. What new challenges and opportunities did this period bring for the Indian working class? We'll find out in part 3. Welcome back, Deep Divers. We're in the thick of things now. Exploring the Indian working class in the late 1930s, a time of global upheaval, World War II looming on the horizon. How did these turbulent times impact the lives of Indian workers?
Well, you have to remember that in 1937, provincial elections in India brought the Congress into power in several provinces.
Right.
And this was a significant development
For the labor movement.
for the labor movement, exactly.
So with the Congress at the helm in many regions, did things start to look up for the workers?
There was definitely a shift.
Okay.
Many Congress leaders were sympathetic to labor concerns.
Yeah.
And the overall atmosphere of increased civil liberties
Right.
created a much more favorable environment for unions to operate.
Okay.
So we see this surge in the number of trade unions
Yeah.
and their
Yeah.
membership during this period.
It sounds like there was this sense of renewed hope and possibility.
Absolutely.
Did this translate into concrete improvements for the workers?
To some extent, yes.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that the Congress had to balance these concerns with the interests of Indian industrialists.
Right, of course.
For example, in Bombay, the Congress ministry passed the Bombay Industrial Disputes Act in 1938.
Okay.
This act, while aimed at resolving labor disputes, also imposed restrictions on strikes and lockouts.
So a bit of a mixed bag, progress on some fronts,
Yeah.
but continued limitations
Yes.
and a need for compromise.
Absolutely.
And then World War II erupted,
Yes.
changing everything once again.
It did.
How did this global conflict impact the Indian working class?
Well, the war had a profound impact on India,
Yeah,
and the working class really felt it acutely.
I bet.
Initially, there was widespread opposition to the war,
Okay,
particularly among those who saw it as an imperialist conflict
right.
that didn't really serve their interests.
Makes sense.
Strikes and demonstrations erupted in major industrial centers,
Like Bombay.
reflecting this anti-war sentiment.
It makes sense. They were already grappling with so much economic hardship.
They were.
And the war likely threatened to make things even worse.
Exactly.
But then something interesting happened.
Yes.
When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941,
That's right.
the dynamics within the labor movement shifted dramatically.
They did.
Now, I bet this is where the influence of the Communist Party of India comes back into play.
You got it. The Communist Party of India, which had initially opposed the war,
Right.
now aligned itself with the Soviet Union
Okay.
and began advocating for India's support of the Allied forces.
Okay.
And this created a major rift within the AITUC,
Oh, wow.
leading to yet another split in 1941.
So the external conflict of World War II is
Yeah.
causing further internal division?
Within the Indian labor movement.
Wow.
And the split in 1941 resulted in the formation of the Indian Federation of Labor, or IFL,
Okay.
under the leadership of M.N. Roy.
Right.
This new federation supported the war effort,
Okay.
aligning itself with the Congress and the British government.
Wow. So now we have the AITUC largely opposing the war
Yes.
and the AFL supporting it.
Right.
How did these opposing stances actually play out as the war progressed?
It was a complicated time.
Yeah.
The war years brought immense hardship for the Indian working class.
Right.
Prices of essential goods just skyrocketed.
Right.
Shortages became really commonplace.
Yeah.
And workers faced increased exploitation
Right.
as the colonial government really prioritized war production.
So the workers are caught in the crossfire,
Yeah.
facing pressure from both sides.
In many ways, yes. But despite all these challenges,
Right.
they continued to fight for their rights.
Good for them.
There were numerous strikes and protests throughout the war, demanding better wages, improved working conditions,
Right.
and an end to all that wartime profiteering.
It's a testament to their resilience and their determination
It is.
that they continue to push for their rights,
Absolutely.
even in the midst of a global war.
They did.
And as the war drew to a close,
And India moved closer to independence.
Right.
The working class, who had played such a pivotal role
absolutely,
in shaping the nation's destiny,
yes,
looked towards a future free from colonial rule.
they did.
It's been an incredible journey, hasn't it?
It really has.
From the early stirrings of worker consciousness
Yeah.
to the rise of these organized labor unions,
Right.
the ideological battles, the splits,
That's a split.
the impact of global events.
So many factors.
The Indian working class has seen it all.
They have.
As we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
what are some of the key takeaways you think our listeners should remember,
Well,
especially those preparing for the UPSC exams?
I think it's crucial to understand that the Indian working class movement wasn't just about wages and working conditions.
Right.
It was deeply intertwined with that broader struggle for self-rule.
Right.
Workers recognized that their fight for dignity and justice
Yeah.
was inseparable from the nation's quest for freedom.
That's such a powerful insight.
Their struggle really becomes a microcosm of India's larger fight for autonomy and self-determination.
Exactly.
And this interconnectedness
Yeah.
is something UPSC aspirants should definitely keep in mind.
Absolutely.
Understanding those various phases of the movement,
Right.
the key organizations involved,
Right.
the ideological debates that shaped its trajectory,
Absolutely.
and the impact of major events like the World Wars.
Well, crucial.
These are all crucial elements.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And don't forget about those influential figures like Gandhi, Tilak,
Right?
and those various labor leaders.
Right.
Their ideas and actions
Absolutely.
shaped the movement.
In profound ways.
They did.
It's a history full of fascinating personalities and turning points.
It is.
Before we sign off,
Sure.
I have one final question for our listeners.
Okay.
How do you think the legacy of the Indian working class movement continues to shape India today? What challenges and opportunities lie ahead for organized labor?
In the 21st century. Something to ponder as you continue your deep dive into Indian history.
It is.
Don't forget to check out the show notes for additional resources on this topic.
We have a lot.
Articles, books, documentaries.
A whole shebang.
And if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future deep dives.
We'll be back.
Until next time,
Keep exploring.
we're learning.